That night, she understood Zubair's intentions. He was once again seeking her closeness. With that realization, she resolved that she would uncover the secret that had been plaguing her mind for so long. After evening prayers, she lay down in her room and pulled the blanket over herself. Pretending to suffer from a severe headache, she made it clear she wouldn't be joining the family for dinner. Zubair, who was easily appeased by her soft-spoken excuse, believed her when she said she had taken medicine and just needed some rest to feel better. Satisfied, he left her alone. She knew Zubair's routine well enough. After dinner, he would head out as usual, and the rest of the family would retire to their rooms. Certain of this pattern, she shut her door tightly and waited. From her bed, she could hear her mother-in-law muttering in the kitchen as she prepared the meal, her words sharp and biting. But Sonia lay silently, detached from the petty comments, her mind fixated on the mystery she intended to solve. Peeking through a slight crack in the door, she saw the family gathered around the table. When the meal was done, her in-laws made their way to their rooms. A short while later, Zubair, after lingering briefly, glanced around cautiously and then got up. Sonia immediately recognized the signs. She knew what he was planning to do. Her suspicion confirmed, she quickly turned back to her bed, propping up pillows and covering them with her blanket to give the impression she was still lying there. Then, as quietly as possible, she moved to the door. For just a fleeting moment, doubt entered her mind. Perhaps she should abandon her plan. Perhaps it was better not to know. But that moment of hesitation passed quickly, replaced by the determination she had carried with her for weeks. She would not change her mind. Steeling herself, she stepped outside, walking softly and steadily. Zubair stood in the courtyard, phone pressed to his ear. She couldn't make out what he was saying, but he spoke only briefly, his voice low. After slipping the phone back into his pocket, he looked around once more before heading off. He didn't glance back to see if anyone was watching him. It was as if he didn't care, or perhaps he was confident no one dared follow him. Sonia's heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't a bold or worldly woman. She was a simple girl from a rural village, with little education but plenty of determination. She had no idea what would come of her actions. Would it bring her peace or lead to more trouble? She couldn't know, but in that moment, she was driven by the need to understand. Holding her trembling hands to her chest, she steadied her breathing and began following Zubair step by cautious step. The night had taken full hold. Darkness spread in every direction, and a biting chill pierced the air. Pulling her shawl tighter, Sonia pressed on. She was careful to keep her distance, walking just far enough behind Zubair that he wouldn't notice her. It was clear he had no idea he was being followed. After a short distance, Zubair came to a stop, standing still as if waiting for someone. Sonia ducked behind a tree, holding her breath. Her hands trembled as she peeked out to keep an eye on him. Despite her outward show of bravery, fear coursed through her veins. Her knees felt weak, and beads of sweat formed on her brow despite the cold. For a moment, she questioned herself again. Should she just go back? What difference did it make if he was up to no good? Why did she have to get involved? But turning back wasn't an option anymore. She was too far out. Whatever Zubair was planning, Sonia felt compelled to know. There was no room for retreat. After waiting there for a while, Zubair stood still, looking around as if expecting someone. Then, someone started walking towards him. Squinting her eyes to make out the figure, Sonia soon recognized who it was. It was Furkan, Zubair's friend, who was approaching quickly with something discreetly held in his hands. For a few minutes, the two spoke in hushed tones before walking off again. Despite her trembling hands and pounding heart, Sonia followed them once more. She was determined that tonight, at long last, she would get to the bottom of this mystery. The two men moved toward a more secluded area. When they finally stopped, they positioned themselves under a tree near a low wall. They sat on the wall, facing the dense forest ahead, their backs turned to the path from which they had come. This made it difficult for Sonia to see them clearly. She tried to keep her distance, observing them from behind a tree. After a while, she cautiously moved closer and settled down behind the wall, just enough to catch glimpses of them. Even so, She could not make out their faces distinctly in the darkness, nor could she hear what they were saying. It seemed as though they weren't speaking at all, until Zubair's voice suddenly pierced through the silence. "Did you bring it?" Sonia's heart raced faster, her breathing shallow and quick. She watched as Furkan handed Zubair a small, tightly wrapped bundle. She couldn't tell what it was, but the tension in the air was palpable. Zubair slowly began to open the bundle, while Furkan whispered something to him, his voice barely audible but filled with urgency. "They keep asking why I need deer meat every few days. How much longer can I keep making excuses?" Furkan said quietly. "Deer meat?" Sonia's mind reeled. What could they possibly be doing with deer meat? She pressed herself tightly against the wall, her knuckles turning white as she clenched her fist to keep herself from trembling. The dread that had been building inside her all evening threatened to overwhelm her. As Zubair carefully opened the bundle, he reached inside, took out a piece of what looked like raw meat, and put it straight into his mouth. Furkan flinched visibly, nearly retching as Zubair chewed on the raw meat with the animalistic focus of a predator. Under the pale moonlight, Zubair's face looked eerily inhuman, the scene more like a wild beast feasting on fresh prey than anything Sonia could have imagined. Sonia could barely keep herself from screaming. Her legs felt like they would give out beneath her. Her mind struggled to grasp what she was witnessing. Then, without thinking, she turned and ran. She ran blindly, her only thought to get as far away as possible from the horrifying sight she had just witnessed. Her panic was so overwhelming that she couldn't tell if anyone was chasing her or calling out her name. The terror had taken hold completely, and she was certain she would collapse from sheer fear. This was not the beginning of her ordeal. It had all started 2 months into her marriage. On that night, plagued by doubts and whispering fears, Sonia had made up her mind. She had to find out what was going on, no matter what. Since then, her life had been filled with gnawing questions and sleepless nights. But she never imagined that she would uncover something so deeply unsettling. Even before that fateful night, she had sensed that something wasn't right. Zubair's behavior had grown more secretive. He would come home late or leave unexpectedly. Sonia had tried to convince herself that it was all in her head. She would stay up, waiting for him, too anxious to fall asleep. She knew that if she went to bed, he would wake her when he returned, and she hated the thought of being startled out of sleep. But even as she sat by the door, exhaustion weighing her down, her mind raced with questions. What had she stumbled into? Sonia knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now. In the evening, Sonia was busy cooking in the kitchen when Zubair returned home. He sat down beside his mother, who glanced at him with a knowing look and said, "Zubair, it's been 2 months since your marriage, and we've yet to hear any good news. You know that most of the men in our family share such news within a few months of marriage. Don't tell me you're turning out as lazy as Furkan." Zubair gave his mother an exasperated glance before looking toward the kitchen where Sonia was rolling out bread. They'd been married just 2 months, yet he had to endure this comment nearly every other day. Sonia caught his eye briefly, and Zubair noticed how pale she looked. For a moment, he wanted to give a sharp reply to everyone and put an end to this ongoing pressure. But instead, he silently got up and went to his room. Later, Sonia came in to call him for dinner. He was lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Their marriage had been arranged by his mother's choice, and she had liked Sonia from the start. Zubair had not even taken a proper look at Sonia before their wedding, and even now, they rarely spent time together. Sonia had been shy around him from the very first day, and her hesitation hadn't lessened even after 2 months of marriage. Softly, Sonia invited him to dinner and turned to leave when he suddenly reached out and grabbed her arm. "Come back to the room quickly after dinner," he said firmly. "Don't get caught up in work and make me wait." She knew exactly what he was hinting at. Without a word, she nodded and left the room. Sonia's mind was in turmoil. Tonight, again, she would endure the same overwhelming intensity that had become her new normal. Could anyone grow tired of their marital intimacy after just 2 months? For her, the answer was yes. She was tired. She found it increasingly hard to bear Zubair's intensity, and there were times when she nearly fainted from strain. It felt as if he was no longer a man, but a beast, clawing at her with a ferocity she couldn't understand. Even during dinner, these thoughts lingered in her mind. After finishing the meal, she got up and made tea for everyone. It was a household tradition to have tea together before bed, and tonight was no different. However, something Sonia had been noticing for the past month stood out to her again. She had first dismissed it as a figment of her imagination, but now she was paying close attention. Once Zubair finished eating, he rose and left the house without touching his tea. No one else commented on it, and he didn't say where he was going. He just slipped out quietly. Sonia had tried, on more than one occasion, to ask her mother-in-law about Zubair's whereabouts, but her questions were brushed aside or ignored. How could she know where her son went every night? Zubair always left without telling anyone and returned when everyone else was fast asleep. Sonia had also noticed that on nights when he snuck out, the other family members would go to bed earlier than usual. It was as if they all had some unspoken agreement, leaving Sonia to feel increasingly uncomfortable. She was starting to feel like an outsider in her own home, unaware of what was truly happening around her. Her unease grew as she waited for him. She had no idea what was going on. When the door finally opened, Zubair walked in. His flushed face and faint smirk did not escape her notice. Without a word, he went straight to the bathroom, a routine he had followed every time he returned late. He would bathe before emerging, his expression unreadable. Sonia had tried asking him about it before, but he always responded harshly, silencing her. When he came out, Zubair approached Sonia, who was sitting on the bed. She looked at him, her mind swimming with questions, but she found herself drawn to him in that moment. His proximity felt soothing, even as her thoughts remained tangled. Gently, he reached out, but in a heartbeat, his touch turned rough, almost animalistic. Sonia froze, startled by the sudden shift. Every time he came close to her, he would start gently, speaking softly, but before long, it turned into something savage. Zubair would claw at her, as though he were no longer human. She would bite her lip to keep from crying out, knowing full well that even if she screamed, even if the world came running, they would all judge her harshly. She endured this in silent pain every night, and by morning, he was back to being his usual self. Sonia couldn't understand what overcame him at night that turned him into something worse than a beast. It had begun on their wedding night. Sonia had sat in their room, dressed beautifully, her heart filled with dreams and expectations. She had seen Zubair for the first time during their nikah, and he had seemed ordinary but acceptable. Yet, she had felt a natural fear, the kind every young bride experiences when stepping into the unknown. She was anxious about what kind of person he would be. Living with them were her aging father-in-law, who was gentle but frail, and her mother-in-law, who was a strong, capable woman. Zubair also had a younger brother who was rarely home, preferring to wander around. Sonia herself was her father's darling daughter and the eldest sister to two younger brothers. Her new life, however, was anything but the fairy tale she had imagined. That first night, Zubair had spent some time chatting with her. His tone was kind, and she felt at ease. But just as she began to feel comfortable, he asked her to change her clothes and left the room. He didn't return for an hour, and when he did, he seemed different. His demeanor had shifted. Sonia was confused but told herself it was just tiredness or the stress of the wedding. He didn't speak much, and she convinced herself to ignore his strange behavior. By morning, he was cheerful and talkative again, as though nothing had happened. For the next few nights, this pattern repeated. Zubair would leave late at night, come back changed, and then act as if all was normal by morning. Sonia tried to dismiss it as a quirk. Perhaps he had a habit of taking long walks at night. Yet every time he returned, he sought her company with an intensity that left her breathless. She grew more hesitant to ask questions, especially since she feared his sudden changes in mood. Over time, she noticed that her mother-in-law's attitude was also unpredictable. Sometimes her mother-in-law would treat her kindly, as if she were her own daughter, and other times her demeanor would grow so harsh that Sonia was left wondering what she had done wrong. Still, Sonia made up her mind to accept these people as her family. She never raised her voice or spoke out against her in-laws. She endured the erratic behaviors without complaint, believing it was her duty to maintain harmony. Yet, she couldn't ignore the fact that something strange was going on. There were nights when Sonia would wake early to pray and find her mother-in-law already up, moving around the house. One night, Sonia gathered her courage and stepped outside her room to see what was happening. She caught sight of smoke billowing from the kitchen. Alarmed, she rushed in, only to find her mother-in-law standing with her back to the door, holding something that was emitting thick, rolling plumes of smoke. The kitchen was engulfed in it. Sonia froze. Her heart pounded in fear. What was her mother-in-law doing? Sonia backed away quietly, her mind racing. She later mentioned it to Zubair, hoping he might explain. Instead, he grew angry. Just stay out of it. You don't need to meddle in my mother's business. His sharp response silenced her. Sonia lowered her head, feeling both confused and ashamed. She didn't dare bring it up again. After that, whenever she witnessed something strange in the house, she would remain silent out of fear of her in-laws. But this was different. This was her husband, Zubair, and she couldn't ignore what she was seeing. Gradually, she stopped dismissing his peculiar behavior as a figment of her imagination. She knew now, with terrifying clarity, that what she was experiencing was no illusion, but a deeply unsettling reality. Each time Zubair returned home late at night, he would quietly draw her close. And when she was entirely helpless, he would unleash an almost inhuman ferocity upon her. It was as if he transformed into a beast, leaving her sobbing in pain. Yet, he seemed utterly unaware of the devastation he caused. Sonia thought she could endure this intensity, but two things kept gnawing at her: the mysterious nights when Zubair left the house, and the occasional red stains on his clothes when he returned. Zubair had a habit of coming home late, showering immediately, changing into fresh clothes, and then approaching her. On rare occasions when circumstances prevented him from going out, Sonia noticed a distinct difference. He wasn't as wild or aggressive. Instead, he seemed subdued, almost detached. But on those nights, he also appeared deeply troubled, as if a weight he couldn't share pressed heavily upon him. He would pace the house, sometimes confiding quietly with his mother. Sonia would watch them, puzzled, and when she tried asking Zubair directly, he would either deflect or offer vague reassurances. In the midst of all this, Sonia's father-in-law remained silent. He held no real authority in the household, where Zubair's mother had the final say in every matter. This often left Sonia feeling alone and hesitant to confide in her father-in-law. What if he shared her concerns with her mother-in-law, making her position in the house even more precarious? So she kept her fears to herself, though they weighed on her every day. One night, however, Sonia did something that went against her nature. She was not a bold woman. Fearful and reserved by nature, she rarely ventured beyond the known. But that night, driven by an unyielding need to uncover the truth, she found the courage to step out. She followed Zubair, determined to understand what took him away so regularly. If he had discovered her actions that night, it might have been her last day in that house. Zubair, after all, shared everything with his mother, and Sonia never dared go against their wishes. Zubair had been growing increasingly insistent that they needed to have a child soon. He often mentioned that once they had a son, many of his troubles would disappear. The pressure to bear a son weighed heavily on Sonia. She had overheard her mother-in-law's sharp comments, subtly blaming her for any delay in having a child. Even in those early months of their marriage, it was clear that the family expected nothing less than a son. Sonia worried endlessly about what would happen if she didn't have a son. She feared the consequences, the possible rejection, the unknown punishments. For now, all she could think about was becoming pregnant as soon as possible, if only to quiet the rising voices around her, to prove that she could become a mother, that there was nothing wrong with her. In this environment, the pressure on new brides to quickly announce a pregnancy had become a crushing expectation. The whispers, the subtle nudges, and the outright remarks had grown so pervasive that they seemed ingrained into the very fabric of the household. Sonia felt the weight of generations bearing down on her, as though she alone was responsible for the family's name and status. And if she did not announce the good news, the blame would fall squarely on her shoulders. Society would brand her as lazy or deficient, never pausing to reflect that it was not something within her control. This was a matter of divine will, something only God could grant or withhold. If it were His will, it could happen in an instant. If not, a lifetime of waiting would yield nothing. The early months of marriage should be spent getting to know each other, building understanding and trust. Only then should couples look forward with hope and prayer that God will bless them with the gift of children, whether that child is a boy or a girl. But how could Sonia make them understand this? The entire family, her mother-in-law, her husband, even extended relatives, seemed focused solely on one goal: a male heir. That evening, after Zubair returned home, Sonia overheard another whispered conversation between him and his mother. It deepened the fissure of doubt in her heart. There was clearly something they were keeping from her. She saw Zubair retreat to his room and lie down, something he rarely did right after coming home. Later, he told her to be ready and left the house. That night, Sonia decided that she would find out the truth. Whatever secret was being guarded so tightly, she would uncover it. The resolve took all the courage she could muster. Sonia wasn't a naturally bold or adventurous person. She had never been one to wander alone, let alone under the cover of night. Yet this time, she was driven by something stronger than fear. If she had been caught, if Zubair had realized she was following him, it might have been the end of her marriage, or worse. For Zubair was deeply loyal to his mother, and Sonia knew that any disobedience on her part would be reported back to the matriarch. Zubair himself seemed consumed by the need for a son. He often hinted that having a male child would resolve many of his problems. The pressure to produce a son weighed heavily on Sonia. She knew, deep down, that Zubair and his mother only cared about a male heir. They didn't say it outright, but the expectation was clear. And what if she didn't have a son? The thought terrified her. What punishment would await her then? But that night, her worries about producing a son were eclipsed by the sheer horror of what she had discovered. When she returned home after following Zubair, she was trembling uncontrollably. She had seen him eat raw meat, savagely tearing at it in a way that was both primal and revolting. It was unlike anything she had ever imagined. She slammed the door behind her, sinking to the floor as the nightmarish images replayed in her mind. For months, she had endured Zubair's brutality in the bedroom, wondering why he became so animalistic. Now she understood. The man who shared her bed in her home was not merely cruel, he was monstrous. She couldn't shake the memory of him, bathed in moonlight, gnawing on raw flesh, as if it were normal. Zubair's increasingly erratic behavior had never made sense to her. He would leave the house, return with red stains on his clothes, and behave as though nothing was wrong. Each time, he would insist on taking a shower and changing clothes before coming near her. She had often questioned him about it, but he always dismissed her concerns or refused to answer. And every time he came near, his touch was no longer that of a husband. It was that of a predator. In the light of what she had seen, everything fell into place. His mysterious nighttime disappearances, the blood-stained clothes, the way he seemed almost possessed when he returned. These were not coincidences. And then there was Furkan's earlier comment, echoing in her ears, "Deer meat. Raw deer meat." It all made sense now. Furkan was supplying Zubair with the raw meat, fueling the transformation that turned him into the wild, feral creature Sonia had witnessed. The pieces of the puzzle fit together, but the picture they formed was more horrifying than anything Sonia could have imagined. Sitting against the door, Sonia shivered not just from fear, but from the realization that she was trapped. Her husband wasn't merely a difficult man or a stern traditionalist. He was something far worse. Her mind raced back to stories she had heard as a child, tales of people who, once they developed a taste for human flesh, would do anything to satisfy their cravings. Could Zubair have crossed that line? Sonia couldn't bear to think about what might come next. The man outside the door, the man she had married, was not the man she had thought he was. And if she opened that door now, she wasn't sure if she would be facing her husband or the beast he had become. Everyone dreaded those man-eating humans, but whenever her grandmother told such tales, Sonia thought they were nothing more than made-up stories, far removed from reality. She never imagined that such horrors would one day become her own lived experience. Zubair banged on the door, so fiercely it seemed like he might break it down at any moment. With trembling hands, Sonia finally stood up and reluctantly opened it. The sight of the man entering made her scream again. Zubair quickly clamped his hand over her mouth, and a foul, nauseating smell emanated from him, hitting her nose. Perhaps Furkan had followed him back to the house, because soon enough he, too, entered the room along with Zubair. Without waiting, Zubair leaned close to her and said in a low, measured voice, "Don't shout. I'll explain everything to you." Sonia, her tears flowing freely, struggled to break free. She ran to her father-in-law, pointed at Zubair, and stammered, "Uncle, Zubair eats raw deer meat. I saw it with my own eyes. He's not human." But her father-in-law, instead of reacting with shock or anger, simply lowered his head. Sonia was stunned. It dawned on her that everyone else in the household knew the truth, everyone except her. The betrayal burned deeply as she gazed around at their expressionless faces. Zubair grabbed her arm, gently leading her back to the couch. Sitting down across from her, he leaned in, his voice softer now. "Look, Sonia," he began, "I do all this only for you. For you, for our future son, for the happiness of our family." Sonia couldn't believe what she was hearing. This man who had been so forceful, so monstrous, was now pleading and apologetic. Tears blurred her vision as she watched him continue. "You think I'm a monster, don't you?" he said. "But I'm not. I don't eat raw meat because I want to. I do it because I have no choice. When we have our son, our firstborn, I'll stop. I promise." His voice cracked, and Sonia could see the raw desperation in his eyes. She remained silent, staring at him as he spoke. His lips were still stained with blood, tiny pieces of meat visible in the corners of his mouth. The sight turned her stomach. Zubair, usually so dominant and terrifying, now seemed pitiful and broken. Everyone in the room, her father-in-law, her mother-in-law, Furkan, stood around in tense silence. Her mother-in-law's piercing glare was locked on her son, as if willing him to stop talking. But Zubair pressed on, ignoring her disapproving looks. He needed Sonia to understand. "When I was born," he began, his voice quivering, "I was weak, timid, nothing like the men in our family. All the boys are expected to be strong, fearless, but me? I was a disappointment. The whole family mocked me. They said he's so timid, it would have been better if he'd been born a girl." Can you imagine that? A boy being told he should have been a girl. He shook his head bitterly. "My mother was desperate," he continued, casting a glance at his mother, who sat quietly, her head lowered. "She took me to the shrine of a revered holy man. He gave her an amulet to hang around my neck, and he performed rituals, said prayers to make me braver. And it helped, somewhat. I wasn't scared anymore, but I still wasn't the fearless man they wanted me to be. I kept to myself, rarely spoke to anyone outside the family, except Furkan. I was too ashamed." He paused, his voice growing softer, tinged with an old sorrow. "When we got married, my mother feared that you'd see how weak I am and lose all respect for me. She didn't want me to be overshadowed in my own home, to have no authority. And the holy man warned her that if I remained timid, our son might inherit my weakness. That terrified her. She'd do anything to ensure that her grandson wouldn't suffer like I did." Sonia looked at her mother-in-law. She sat still, her shoulders slightly hunched, staring at the floor. There was no pride, no denial, only resignation. She had known all along. She had played her part in this twisted drama. This was all foretold by the Pir Baba, who had advised Zubair's mother that before approaching his wife, he must consume raw deer meat. Only then would their firstborn son be born brave, strong, and full of valor. He needed to establish dominance over his wife, making her completely subservient, or so his mother believed. But Zubair insisted he never harbored any ill will towards Sonia. He only went through these gruesome rituals out of the misguided hope that their future child would be powerful and that their family line would flourish. He had even prayed fervently for a child, believing that once their son arrived, he could finally let go of this bizarre practice. Sonia listened in stunned silence as he pleaded, "Please don't misunderstand me. I do all of this for you, so our child can be strong and so our relationship remains solid. This is what my mother and the Pir Baba told me I had to do. But I promise as soon as we have a child, I'll stop. I don't want this life either." His voice cracked as he spoke, and for the first time, Sonia saw him as a pitiful figure, trapped in a web of superstition spun by his mother and their religious leader. She glanced at her mother-in-law, who sat silently nearby, her head bowed. In that moment, it became clear that Zubair's mother had orchestrated everything. Sonia turned toward her mother-in-law and asked, her voice trembling with disbelief, "How can you justify this? You know none of this is true, yet you forced Zubair into these practices. You've turned my husband into something monstrous, and you're complicit, uncle, in letting this happen. Don't you see how vile and dehumanizing it is to eat raw meat before approaching one's own wife? I've even seen you burning something in the corners of the house, placing amulets. When will it end?" Her mother-in-law's face hardened, her voice sharp as she retorted, "You're a young and foolish girl. You don't understand the powers of the Pir Baba. We follow his guidance because we trust in his spiritual authority. If you tell Zubair to stop eating the meat, he might leave you. Don't challenge our traditions." Sonia stared at her with incredulity. These people still clung to old, superstitious traditions, remnants of ignorance from time long past. Her voice firm, she declared, "If Zubair refuses to abandon these filthy practices, I refuse to stay here. I will leave this house tomorrow and never come back." Zubair's eyes widened in panic. He couldn't imagine a life without Sonia. For all his flaws, he loved her, and the thought of losing her terrified him. In front of everyone, he began to plead, "Please don't leave. I can't live without you. And if you tell anyone about this, what will people think of me? What will they say?" Sonia raised a hand, cutting him off. "If you continue with this habit, I'll leave. But if you swear to never touch raw meat again, if you promise to stop these grotesque rituals, I might consider staying. But I won't stand by silently and watch you behave like an animal." Sonia's words hit Zubair hard. For the first time, he began to see the absurdity of his actions. Even Furkan, his loyal friend, had advised him repeatedly to stop. Furkan had warned him, "This is nothing but shirk, false, ungodly practices. Leave it behind before it's too late." But Zubair's mother had always shut him down, insisting, "Furkan has no children of his own because he never followed these traditions." Furkan's own marriage was now 2 years old, and he and his wife remained childless. His mother-in-law used that fact to justify continuing the rituals, blaming Furkan's rejection of the Pir Baba's teachings. But now, faced with Sonia's ultimatum and Furkan's repeated admonishments, Zubair finally made a decision. He would no longer let himself be a pawn in his mother's game. For the first time, he chose to rely on his own judgment. Turning to Sonia, Zubair said, "I'll stop. I promise, from this day forward, I'll never touch raw meat again. I'll end these harmful traditions and focus on building a real future with you." Sonia looked at him carefully, searching for sincerity in his eyes. And then, slowly, she nodded. "If you mean what you say, if you truly change, I'll stay. But you must leave these vile habits behind." Zubair held her hands tightly, vowing never to return to those dark rituals. And Sonia, still wary but willing to give him a chance, decided to stay. She remembered the teachings of her faith. A husband and wife are garments for each other, meant to cover one another's faults and protect each other's dignity. She resolved to never expose Zubair's past to the world if he proved himself to be a changed man. True to his word, Zubair never touched raw meat again. He left behind the practices of the Pir Baba, stopped relying on Furkan for nightly deliveries, and focused on rebuilding trust with his wife. Within a year, Sonia gave birth to their first child, a beautiful baby girl. Though Zubair's family had hoped for a son, Sonia and Zubair both felt immense joy. They realized that their happiness didn't depend on outdated traditions or gender expectations, but on the love and respect they had rebuilt. In time, Zubair found peace in his decision to break away from his mother's influence. He and Sonia slowly repaired their relationship, and together they vowed to raise their daughter in a home free from the superstitions that had once poisoned their lives. They wanted a life rooted in faith, not fear, a life where their child would grow up knowing that their worth was not tied to rituals or gender, but to the values they upheld and the love they shared as a family.